Alright, as promised in this video, we are going to speculate on what the heck the Erd Tree even is. We are going to try to solve that mystery. Now, to let people know where I am, this video is going to be a spoilerific video. Spoilers are coming, but I have just finished the capital city of Leyndell, and if you aren't there yet, then expect to get spoiled on something in this video. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground. I am going to be talking about it kind of in more broad terms. I'm not going to bring up specific items and item descriptions. I'm just going to go through the various things that I've observed while I make my case for what I think the Erd Tree actually is from the position of someone who has not finished the game yet, and if anything later in the game disproves this, then it just does, and I'm wrong. But hopefully, at least through my ramblings, you'll get a better appreciation for what the story is trying to accomplish, even if I don't actually get what the ending is supposed to be with perfect accuracy, or what the setting is supposed to be with perfect accuracy. So, like always, I've got my outline, and I'm going to say something that is completely outrageous. The Erd Tree is actually Soylent Green. I've got defenses for that. I have arguments. First is something that I observed when I first finished one of the mini dungeons, and I'm sure everyone has observed this a little bit if they looked a bit more closely at the back wall of the boss room of any of the mini dungeons that they have explored, and that is that these are roots, but within the roots are the bodies of dozens of people that are crawling up into the roots and being absorbed into the roots. My next bit of evidence for this is the two fingers themselves. When we see the two fingers in the round table hold, they are very lifelike. They are living-esque. They are fleshy. When you look at them closely, the lesions on their skin are red. The cuts of the skin are very sinewy. But when you look at the two fingers at the top of the Great Towers, where we restore the great runes that we get from the lords the shard bearers that we kill, those two fingers, if you look closely, look very woody. The inside of the fingers very much look like wood rather than flesh, which means the fleshy bits that we're seeing on the two fingers in the round table hold is still something more external. It's still a middle outer layer. But when we get further in, the fingers themselves are plant-like, they are wood, and the fingers are able to communicate directly with the Erd Tree and thus directly with the greater will. For that to happen, I would imagine that they are in fact branches of the Erd Tree. These fleshy fingers are in fact plants, but that could also mean that the Erd Tree itself is a giant tree of flesh. And that sounds really freaking disgusting, right? So what exactly are they going for? I'm not the first person who has noticed that the Erd Tree itself is something of a reference to Yggdrasil from, is it Norse mythology? Norse mythology, I'm going to say. If it's not Norse mythology, I want someone to correct me in the comments. But the Yggdrasil is the giant world tree that holds up the various realms of Norse mythology. The world in which we inhabit is just one of those worlds being held by its branches. Elden Ring actually looks like it is inverting a lot of the Norse mythology that it is inspired by. For example, the Erd Tree, which is supposed to be Yggdrasil, is not holding up the world, but seems to be a later addition to it. And we know this because in exploring underground segments, we see that there is plenty of civilizations and events that occurred before the Erd Tree arrived. And we also know that the study of glintstone sorcery predates the Erd Tree, and there is a distinction between the castles that existed before the Erd Tree's arrival, before Stormvale Castle, and the arrival of Godfrey and his lineage, because each of the other castles have an astrolabe, for studying the stars, which is the origin of glintstone sorcery. But castles and churches associated with the Erd Tree do not have these astrolabes. Or at least in my experience of playing the game, churches that are dedicated to Marika or have the Radagon statue or any of the other things don't have astrolabes next to them. And some of the glintstone sorcerers that we talk to, especially the very first one, tell us directly that glintstone sorcery was originally the study of the stars and life that came from the stars, but that study has waned. And it has waned because the new hotness arrived, the Erd Tree arrived, and that became the central religious authority of the world, or at least of the lands between. There is alluded to worlds or countries outside of this game space, as From Software likes to do, but they're also just kind of references to, hey, look, Japan exists in some capacity, references to their previous games, that sort of thing. There, of course, is also the existence of giants, which are a central antagonist in a lot of Norse mythology that we can either see as deceased bodies that speckle the land, or as smaller giants that we actually fight throughout the game. And finally, and this is a big spoiler for things that happen right after you finish Leyndell, is that there is no Ragnarok in this setting. In fact, the problem is the inciting event of the game that is alluded to in the opening cutscene is kind of described as being the exact opposite of a Ragnarok, that the idea of destined death, the rune of death, was stolen from the Greater Will, from the Elden Ring. And because of that, the world cannot proceed to its actual end. Death was stolen from the Greater Order, and so there is no Ragnarok coming. Or at least there is no Elden Ring's version of Ragnarok that is coming to end things at the predestined, decided time. So then the next question is, what is our character's role in all this? As Tarnished, we are supposed to be seeking grace, following the Greater Will, following the Erd Tree, and coming to some kind of destiny, regardless of the events that have happened. So we have to ask, what exactly is the Tarnished? And for that, I have to start actually at Godric, because Godric and his lineage are actually described as being made from the Erd Tree, that they are living embodiments of it, and thus they became the first lords, the first kings of this order. And the central thing that makes Godric a character is the fact that he is grafting the parts of Tarnished onto his body. Now, for those of you who aren't all that into botany, grafting is actually a process by which a plant is grown by attaching it to another plant. You can take the branch of one tree, of say one fruit tree, and if you know how to graft it and what tree to graft it on, you can actually graft it to a different fruit tree and have a tree that grows two different kinds of fruit. In actuality, it's two separate trees, and one is just somewhat parasitically attached to the original, but that's essentially how grafting works. Plants are remarkably variable forms of life. They can survive for a very long time, completely cut off from any other part of the plant body. However, Godric only grafts Tarnished onto his body. He doesn't graft non-tarnished onto his body, which would suggest that he might not be able to graft anything other than other Tarnished onto his body. And I say other for a reason, because the Tarnished were also made by the Erd Tree. And it is because we were made by the Erd Tree that we are guided by the Erd Tree's light of grace, and then are sent on this quest to fulfill our destiny, to go and collect all of the great runes of the Elden Ring and bring it back to the Erd Tree. And as one last little bit of evidence for what I'm about to put forth, if you're doing the Volcano Manors quest line and you're speaking to Lady Tarnished at one point, the lady in charge of the manor, she will actually say something along the lines of them rebelling against their own heritage, that you, as a Tarnished, fighting other Tarnished through the manor, are rebelling against their heritage. Now, notice she didn't say something like lineage. She didn't say authority. She didn't say government or power. She said heritage. And the rest of the manor quest line also uses a significant amount of familial language, so there's no reason to think that when Lady Tarnished says heritage, she doesn't mean it in a familial way. So our characters are in fact not metaphorically related to the Erd Tree, but literally related to the Erd Tree. Both our characters and the gods of this world, the shard bearers, the other lords or people aiming to be lords, they are plants in the form of people. They are little Erd Tree seedlings, just in a different form than all of the other roots of Erd Tree springing up and minor Erd Trees that are showing up all over the world. And this setting somewhat folds into a lot of the Christian imagery that the game is using. The biggest Christian imagery that it presents is obviously Marika, who is presented in her statues as being crucified. There are plenty of crosses that litter the lands that show Tarnished being crucified. There are crucifixions left and right, and if you're not getting a Western Christian-inspired narrative sense from that, then you probably don't have all that much familiarity with the imagery of Catholicism or other Christian denominations. Second, the idea that all of the characters and the gods are begotten by the Erd Tree matches with Christian doctrine as well. It is a kind of anti-apotheosis, where apotheosis is the idea of a person being raised to godhood. What made Christianity somewhat distinct was that God actually came down and became a person. And so Christianity was somewhat of an inversion on the typical religious narratives of the time, where the gods were always above, people were always below, but some great people could rise to the level of godhood, or sometimes people would present themselves or believe themselves to be gods on the planet, but did not think themselves people. They thought themselves just gods. Whereas Christianity was very specifically, no, God turned into a human. And a lot of Catholic doctrine, which was a big part of a lot of schisms, as people argued this point over the centuries, was that Jesus could be of two natures, being both God and man simultaneously, and a lot of people disagreeing with that idea and having their own take on what that actually means. So then we get to grace and what the heck grace is supposed to be. Is it just light? Is it just pointing the way? Well, that's the next thing that I want to try to answer. What is grace in this setting? Now, if I were to follow the literal narrative that I have set up so far, then grace would be something somewhat akin to plant pheromones. They would be spores, or perhaps you could even think of grace as shiny dandruff. And to that extent, we could also think of runes, the material that we are collecting to level up, the things that the shard bearers are holding into themselves to wield great power. We can think of grace as being grafted onto our bodies to give us power, just as Godric was grafting the Tarnished onto his body to give himself some power. Under the Erd Tree, the grace weather, where we have the shining, speckling golden lights falling down, we can also see the connection to rune there, metaphorically, because In that weather condition, characters are actually able to earn more rune by slaying enemies during that weather pattern. So that would suggest that little flecks of grace and rune are one and the same. Oh, and one more thing that I'm going to just kind of tack onto here. I just found the 3 fingers, and if you think about it, the Erd tree has 2 fingers, which are part of the Erd tree and the Golden Order, but then there's 3 fingers that are supposed to be heretical and against the Golden Order. But you put 2 and 3 together, you've got 5, which is a hand. The hand of God. I just figured I'd point that one out before moving on to saying that literal readings are boring, though. Yeah, it's kind of gross and cool to think of these things as plants and flesh being one and the same, and somehow that being connected as some kind of organism, and that it's actually not God's, but yeah, of course it wasn't. What I'm more interested in is what is the metaphorical intention of the grace itself? What is the message that the story is trying to communicate through this interplay of metaphors? And if you know your Christian history, clashes over the concept of grace and what grace means in the Christian tradition are largely responsible for tons of schisms out of the Catholic Church, out of Eastern Orthodoxy, into more specified individual Christianities that all have a different answer for what grace is and what it means. For my part, I think that the game is still starting at the philosopher Augustine of Hippo, or Saint Augustine, you might have heard him called. Saint Augustine's philosophy was foundational to what is the canonical beliefs of the Catholic Church for hundreds of years. For example, the Catholic Church's version of epistemology, how knowledge works in the Catholic tradition, was Augustine of Hippo's illumination theory, that human bodies, sure, they're able to observe things, but they only rationalize and understand things. They only have knowledge because God, with the form of knowledge, because God is the perfection of all things, all forms. There's some Platonism coming into how Romans came to interpret the teachings of Christianity and explain them through Roman and Greek philosophy, that the form of knowledge came from God, radiating outward as light that shone directly onto the soul or the mind. And that was what was called illumination theory, that bodies, biological creatures like animals, can observe things and react to them and still make movements, but it is only because of the light of God radiating down onto the soul that one can understand them, that one can know things and thus make decisions. And that leads into another aspect of St. Augustine of Hippo's idea of grace, and that grace was a gift given to man by God, which enabled man to have free will, to act according to his own beliefs and intentions, rather than, as the animals did, automatically, or as a mere aspect of physical motions. The reason under St. Augustine's philosophy that God gives to people free will is to afford people the opportunity for free will to make decisions on their own, and thus either warrant the grace of God, which is the ethical dimension. Are you worthy of God's favor, and thus do you merit getting into heaven? Or are you unworthy of the grace of God? Do you not merit God's gifts, and thus are not worthy of getting into heaven? In this case, heaven is in fact the Erd tree itself. The gates that are blocked off by the thorns when we approach the Erd tree are deciding at that moment that our Tarnished is not worthy. But the idea of worth or worthiness in relation to the Erd tree is actually referenced almost immediately when you come out of the first tutorial area, because we learn immediately that some Tarnished are able to see the light of grace, but other Tarnished lose the ability to see the light of grace, and it basically is determined by what that Tarnished is doing. Why they see the light of grace or not is determined by whether or not the greater will believes the Tarnished will be able to succeed on the task that the greater will has set forth for them. But just like in Catholic history, the Golden Order of the Erd Tree also has tons of schisms that mark separations from the Erd Tree, and those are pretty much rounded up and summarized with all of the various endings other than the main ending that you can go for, whatever that is. But I've seen enough side quests and enough possible options of what kind of lord I want to become to know that there are kind of a lot of different possible endings I could choose. But you could metaphorically see these things as schisms away from the Golden Order, their own religious orders that are forming. But that is a different concept, I think, from all of the other heretical religions that you can find prayer books for and give to Brother Corin. Is that the NPC's name? I don't really remember. They say their names so infrequently, and I don't read their names when I talk to them. So I'm going to call him Brother Corin, but you know the one I'm talking about. The guy who goes and hangs out with the gold mask. When you give him any prayer book that isn't of the Golden Order, which is most the prayer books you're going to find before you get to Leyndell, you are seeing different religious orders that predated the Erd Tree. In my opinion, I believe they predated the Erd Tree and are called heresies by the Golden Order because they are establishing the Erd Tree as the new central religious authority of the world. But yeah, right now, in my opinion, I believe that grace is meant to be a metaphorical middle point between the illumination theory and the free will ethics theory of St. Augustine of Hippo that presents grace as the key to free will under what is essentially Catholic philosophy. But there is a lot of potential that I haven't fully explored as to all of the different schisms away from philosophy to see if they are represented by different interpretations of the Golden Order or of grace by different factions in the game. There could be one faction that's more inspired by Lutheranism, Protestantism, Calvinism. It could go all the way down the list of all the different schisms to see if different schisms away from the Golden Order in the game are related to those. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Am I on the right track? Did my ramblings make any kind of sense? What do you think? Do you think they represent a different kind of idea, a different philosopher entirely? If you have one in mind, I'd love to hear that as well. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel. If you're feeling generous, you can also donate to me on patreon.com/SocraTetris, and I will see you next time. Stay true.